Thank you. Thank you very much, Hassan. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, Professor Tamer, thank you very much for inviting me to this very exciting conference. More or less, I assume, like everybody else who was presenting, I was making my thoughts about what am I actually going to talk about when I talk about the concept of modernity in Islam, because it was not for the first time. But the more you prepare for such a talk, the more you realize that all of the words in this title are contested words. Okay, maybe concept is not as much contested, I'm not sure, but modernity and Islam definitely are. So what I'm going to do in my presentations is I was trying to make a small structure of the whole talk. In the first part, I'm going to say something about these very concepts that I'm working with and how do I understand them in my understanding. I think it's important, as well as in the second part to say a few words about the context in which modernity in Islam, in the broader sense, developed, or in which Muslim negotiated what it means to be modern, what modernity is. And in the last part, I will try to illustrate this with, by providing an example of which is fitting, as I think at least. Now, I guess I do need to tell this audience that there is no such thing as the one Islam, of course. In the German language, it is even more difficult to speak about this because the German language has the articles. In the German language, it is der Islam. And this is actually how it is very often conceptualized in talks about Muslims, Islamic religion, and so on, as being presented as something which is one single unit or one single entity within which things are contained and stored, and more or less in a fixed, unchangeable way. So this imagination of the Islam or der Islam is in itself a product of modernity, but I will talk about this also later. So of course there is not such a thing as the one Islam. But then again, having said this, I have to qualify the qualification because being myself a Muslim and also a scholar of Islam, of course, if you say that there is no Islam, then what are Muslims all over the world, more than a billion of them, referring to when they speak about their religion? Islam is an important reference to them. So is Islam just an empty signifier, to borrow here a term from the semiotics? And here again, I would have to say, no, it is not. I like to illustrate this with an example, with a personal example. So I have a small child, a son, and a husband who is German, and he's a German Muslim, very well versed in the traditions. But when he puts on the shoes on our son's feet in front of my mother, the first thing she says is, son, don't start with the left one, start with the right foot. So the Muslims in this round, I assume, will know what I'm talking about. And he also knows what she's talking about. There's a tradition that if you want to, if you close yourself, that you always start with the right side. And when you take off the clothes, you start with the left one. There's a hadith. So he knows this. He's a German Muslim, grown up in a completely different context, completely different generation, but they understand each other. And they understood this, he understood the meaning, and I assume that many non-Muslims who would hear this for the first time would not know what she was talking about. So this is just an example that sharing knowledge of tradition, its implementation every day, sharing practices, sharing meanings, this is something which is recognizable, and this is something, and this is how Muslims around the world actually do recognize each other, even without, let's say, very visible symbols like hijab or other parts of attire. So in that sense, yes, I do think that there is not such a single entity, fixed entity, unchangeable entity of meanings, or of Islam with unchangeable meanings, but I think that there is a body of knowledge, a set of references to this knowledge that can be labeled the Islam. However, with different and plural and pluralist, even pluralist interpretations, with many different articulations and expressions and so on. So what I describe as my personal experience is, of course, also backed by scholarly observation by a number of them, that there is and there has been a global system of Islam, but one which is not characterized by a several hermeneutic orders, but not one hermetic orders, but basically being a diverse communicative space consisting of plurality and polyphony of voices. So this also applies, in my view, to the ways, and now it becomes a little bit more complex, to the ways in which Muslims around the world, at least across the Muslim world, dealt with the subject matter of modernity, particularly when we put it in relation to religion. So this nexus, Islam and modernity, has been at the center of the negotiations of Muslim identities and of debates on how to shape societies for roughly 200 years now. I think it's not exaggerated to say that the search or the longing for an authentic Islamic modernity has been at the center of the work of many modern Muslim scholars in these past two centuries. And at the same time, the relationship between Islam and modernity is also a constant topic in research in Islamic studies. So, and it has been, for at least in the German context, but not only in the German context, also for the least 150 years, the notion of, or the question, is Islam compatible with modernity? Something which you often hear in the public and popular discourses today as well as being negated and so on. So there are different perspectives on this in the field of Islamic studies in the meantime as well. But for a very large part of the 20th century, both in the Western Europe or Western scholarship and Eastern Europe, let's say in the countries of applied socialism, scholars of Islam have pursued the classical modernization theory when trying to explain the relationship between Muslim societies, between Islam and modernities. So to sketch this briefly, the classical modernization theory, Vasilius has mentioned this, conceptualize the modernities on the one hand as an advancement, of course, of industrialization, urbanization, education, but at the same time being more or less equivalent to the, understanding modernization more or less equivalent with secularization. It also assumed that in the course of these events, of the modernization of societies, industrializations and so on, traditions and religions eventually will disappear because they will become obsolete. And this classical modernization theory, of course, has been challenged for, in many, from many corners. And so we have shifts and developments there just as much as we have this in the observation in the field of Islamic studies. And this brings me now to the next point, the way that we talk about this relation, about Islam modernity, has, of course, to take into account how these concepts and relationships have been dealt with in the scholarship as well. And this is what I will try to embed my talk into a theoretical concept and to try to explain with this how the ways in which Muslims imagined, let's say, specifically Islamic modernities. I'm not really going into much detail in this theoretic attempt, but I have also to say that as much as I would like for it to be originally my idea, it is not. So I build my theoretical approach on the works of a colleague of mine, a scholar of Islamic studies, Danish-German contemporary scholar of Islamic studies, Dietrich Jung, currently at the University of Copenhagen. So Jung has observed that throughout the 20th century, the movement of particularly Islamic reform or modern Islamic movement has expanded in a multiplicity of directions, confronting us with multiple modernities within Islam, and so presenting us with diverse designs of Islam itself. So he tried to conceptualize this, or maybe I can give an example. So the fact that we have at the same time, let's say, the existence of a modern approach to the Quran by Taha Hussein, let's say in Egypt, and at the same time we have the Muslim Brotherhood emerging, with their conceptualizations of history, Quran, and so on, while at the same time, let's say in Saudi Arabia, the Salafi branch of the Wahhabism is on the rise simultaneously at the same time, shows us that we have, even in different, this time in different contexts, but even in the same context, we have different types of modern developments which are competing with each other. So he actually used 3 different approaches to try to conceptualize what modernity is, and to try to grasp this. And I find his approach very convincing. This is why I've been using it, obviously. So to explain this theoretically, he draws or gauge and expands on 3 different models. The first one is the concept of multiple modernities, already mentioned by Vasilios Makridas, developed by Shmuley Eisenstadt, basically saying that the modernization is not a process of convergence, but it's a historical development in which different modern social development paths diverge from each other. And in Eisenstadt's view, the modernity is a combination of unity and difference. So there is a spread of a global program of modernity originating in Western Europe, but it's been adopted in different contexts in different ways, thus giving expression to different forms of modernity at the same time in different contexts. And contrary to the classical modernization theory, Eisenstadt also poses that traditions and religion are a very important part of this whole process. So they're not going to vanish, and they have not vanished, but on the contrary, they have, let's say, shaped these different modernities and had a very formative role in this process. So the unifying components in this view are structural changes like industrialization, urbanization, the development of certain economic order like capitalism, for example, and also the political order of the nation state as being, let's say, something which gives the unity in these different forms of expression. But Jung is not staying or remaining here. He goes further and says, or brings into play another model of modernity, theoretical model, also developed by German sociologist Peter Wagner. I think I have to pronounce him in a German way, Peter Wagner. Peter Wagner. And this second type is the second model is the notion of successive modernities. So what Wagner postulated is that we need to think modernization in his view, 3 subsequent types which followed to each other, also modeled on the European on the history of European societies, starting with the notion of a limited democracy, as it was the case in the 19th century. European countries where only certain elites had access, let's say, to votes and certain rights and so on. Then the next stage would be a sort of organized modernity until the Second World War, where the state had a crucial role in organizing societies, but also controlling, in certain ways, religion and so on. And then the third type would be the pluralist democracies after the Second World War. In Peter Wagner's view, the central tension in this model is the one between autonomy and control. And between individuality, let's say, and collective. So, and in this, it is this tension which is defining these different types of modernity. Now, Dietrich Jung takes this and say, okay, what Wagner conceptualized as successive modernities, we can also see as something that exists at the same time, simultaneously. And this is actually also the case in many in many parts of the Muslim world, and again also in many aspects of Muslim intellectual history. I'm going to come to this in a while. And then the last, let's say, theoretical model from which Dietrich Jung draws, and which is also very central to my research, is the already before also mentioned postcolonial entanglement theories, which put the stress on interdependencies and interactions and exchanges between actors of different cultures in the formation of modernity. So the entanglement theories say that social actors as individuals do not operate within closed single cultural systems. They're always structurally embedded in different cultural systems of reference. What happens here is that modernity is co-constructed between different cultural systems, and religions and tradition do play an important role, but they're only one of those reference points. They're certainly not the central part of it. And what is also important to note is that these processes of entanglement exchange very often take place in asymmetrical power relations, because this is something which derives from the postcolonial perspective. Many of the case studies that this has been drawn upon deal with the colonial situation. And of course, the issue of power relations comes into play very strongly. However, what is also important to note is that in this asymmetry of power, it is not necessarily always the center which is influencing the periphery, but there are also, let's say, not backfiring, but influences back, from the periphery to the center. And again, I hope that I will show this in my presentation as well. So, to sum up, the theoretical design that I'm following conceptualize modernity and Islam, or poses multiple modernities within Islam. So we are not only dealing at the global level with different modernities in different contexts, but within Islam, Islamic society, or Muslim societies, Islamic religion itself, there are multiple modernities. In this context, there is a simultaneous existence of and mutual competition of different types of modernity. Modernities are co-constructed in the process of entanglement and transfer within asymmetrical power relations. So the religion is one, not the only important factor in this process. And what is also important, the religion itself, what is considered religion, it's in this case the different expressions and designs of Islam, is also co-construed in these processes of entanglement, because it's being changed, of course. So, no, just a second. This stress on entanglement, as I already mentioned, coming from the post-colonial theory, but it has been employed in the academia in the recent decades, I would say in the recent 20 to 30 years, and it's of course nothing new, but in general it reflects a change in how we view transnational history by linking our own perspectives, to these processes of communications, exchange and transfer, and away from, let's say, looking at national history or at developments only within one cultural context. So the new research projects, of course, take a broader perspective on the wider history of cultural relations in general, but also on the wider history of intellectual exchange. And thus, they allow us to formulate new perspectives on these relations. Now, I think that we can safely say that the intellectual history of Islam has always been a history of entanglement and transfer from the very beginning on, so from the very start, or the revelation in a very multi-religious context and multicultural context of the late antiquity and so on, to speak with Angelika Neuwirth here. And of course, the developments that happen later have always been a part, or have been, let's say, a result of confrontation, of engagement, refutation, but also adaptation, so different form of contacts with different intellectual and religious traditions, starting with the Hellenistic tradition, but also with the Christian and Jewish traditions of the Middle East and so on. However, the speed and the density, the intensity of these entanglement and transfer processes have highly intensified in the modern times. So in this case, and periodization again is an issue. I think that you had mentioned this with the Jewish history. Where do you begin? You know, the process of modernization, the same debates we also have in the context of Islam. So many would say that the begin of the modernity in Islamic context starts with French occupation of Egypt by the end of the 18th century, while in the meantime we have also historical research going more back into the social movements of the 18th century in the Muslim world, laying the foundations and the ground for many structural changes that later on would come later on with the modernity. However, I think that it also can be said that from the middle of the 19th century onwards, we have not only reforms and structural changes and reforms in the Ottoman Empire and Morocco and so on are to be mentioned in this context as well, the Tanzimat and social reforms that took place there, modernization, let's say, of many social spheres. But it is also at the level of religious thought that we have a paradigmatic shift that I would say was induced by this specific form of several specific forms, basically, of Muslim modernities, and these transformations also changed the field of religious epistemology to a huge extent. So these transfers and entanglements, of course, took place, and they were embedded in broader asymmetrical power relations, the colonial situation being one of them. So the colonial projects of European powers had affected the Muslim world already since the 17th century, going on through the 18th century, so starting with the disintegration of the big three Muslim empires, Safavids, the Mughals in India, and the Ottomans. However, even if we can observe the growing political and economic competition of the Muslim world with European states already before that, and the development of the global supremacy of European powers in economy, particularly, before that. So, you know, there's a lot of research about how the Muslim world was basically taken out of the world markets or pushed out by these types of competitions in commerce and production. But the European colonialism in the Muslim world reached its peak in the second part of the 19th century. So when the indirect colonial rule was now replaced by the new imperialism project, by direct presence in the Muslim society. So what you see here is the map of the world as no, this is not 1815. No, sorry, this is a different, sorry, wrong map. In 1898. I'm not really sure whether it's visible, but enough to state in this context that from all, let's say, of the Muslim majority societies, only the Ottoman Empire and Iran were independent, with, important to note, the Ottoman Empire being completely financially abhängig, oh my God, dependent, thank you very much, from France and England, so from European powers who went in there to control the financial system. So the Ottomans did not have the control of their own state resources back at this time. So from North Africa to South Asia, Muslim societies were almost entirely under the administration of major European powers. And this was the first time that this dominance of the Europeans in the Muslim world, political, cultural, and not least financial dominance, was experienced. And it went down in the memory of Muslim populations as a particular defeat and humiliation. And this is a narrative, this humiliation narrative, of having been defeated back then is something that many political and particularly Islamist movements, but not only them, feed from today, this historical narrative of defeat. But again, also the dealings and negotiations of modernity were strongly informed by this experience. And what was initiated here is a complex process of starting to question the causes of this decline or perceived decline of the Islamic world. I think that the historical science would say otherwise today. So the Ottoman Empire was by far not in the state of the decline as it was maybe perceived back then. But nonetheless, the perceived inferiority and decline of the Muslim world and how to respond adequately to these new situations in which Muslims found themselves, not only Muslims, but the population of Muslim societies in general. So these questions became very important, and they produced different answers on how to deal with this situation, ranging from a very strong rejection of European influences to advocacy of adaptation and cultural synthesis. So in the course of dealing with this issue, we can observe also a further differentiation of Muslim intellectual and religious elites all over the Muslim world. And, but again, we also see the development of, let's say, modern ideologies in the Muslim world, such as nationalism, for example, or in general, the development of national histories. I will say something about that later, but also other let's say, concepts of thought or directions of thought. And this is, of course, due to the fact that the colonial times did not only bring about asymmetries of power, but that with the 19th century, we are talking about a century which, in the words of the German historians Jürgen Osterhammel, transformed the world. And this is his famous book, which I always used to recommend in such context, The Transformation of the World. What I'm not really sure whether you can see this on the right slide, but this time was characterized also by, of course, a huge, by the development of communication technologies and by intensified processes of communication and means of communication and networks, for example, through the telegraph. So what you're seeing here, or not seeing, I'm not really sure, hopefully seeing, are the telegraph wires, across the world at the end of the 19th century, also clearly showing that huge parts of the Middle East were incorporated in it. Then, the next image, which I was hoping that you might see already in this room, is the railroads network in Central Europe and the Mediterranean in 1910, also, showing, and that there is an advert for the famous Orient Express, going from Paris and Vienna to Constantinople, as it says here, to Istanbul. So, but we do not only have the structural or the change of the infrastructure, and this time we also have, the postal service, increased means of communication. You can exchange letters, books, and so on much faster. And this is actually what took place. Translations took place, of press, articles, and so on. So mutual, let's say, reception and perception of many intellectual lines or lines of thought took place here across cultural and national borders. And travel was also something that in this time started also to affect many, or not to affect, but something that many intellectuals and religious scholars from the Middle East also took up by traveling to Europe, to big European cities. A lot of political movements, exile movements, and so on formed actually in West European cities like Paris and Berlin and Geneva. Thank you very much. So it is not really surprising that also the thought of, let's say, modern and reformist or modern Muslim, I would say for first with modern Muslim intellectuals and scholars, especially from the second half of the 19th century onwards, also took place against the background of these strong communicative, social, and discursive entanglements in transnational public spaces. So Muslim thinkers did not live in a vacuum, of course, not shielded from each other and not shielded from the rest of the world. On the contrary, they were part of overlapping intellectual milieus in the Ottoman Empire, in Western Europe, in Egypt, in South Asia, and they participated in shared discourses here. So these milieus included religious thinkers, but also religious scholars, intellectuals, but at the same time also Western philosophers and Western Orientalists and Western scholars of Islamic studies, Christian missionaries who played a very important role in spreading new philosophies, let's say, new developments in Western philosophies in the Middle Eastern world and so on. So they were parts. I'm not also now speaking of painting with a very broad brush. I'm not going into detail with every single one of them, but I'm trying. I'm going to try this in the paper. In the conference paper later on. But what is important for me is to know that the thought of these intellectuals, particularly, as I said, from the second half of the 19th century and the turn of the century until in 1930s, this thought was shaped along the routes between Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Istanbul, Cairo, Calcutta, Qum in Iran, so all the big cities on the one hand of the Ottoman Empire, but also as European cities. And many of them, the most of them that I have here actually had been or were multilingual, so they spoke several languages besides Arabic and Turkish, which was enormously important for the scholars from the Ottoman Empire, but many of them also learned English and German and French as the languages of communication. So, okay, so let me move to the topics that were discussed. Again, so I'm not going into all the single topics here, but what they had in common. So I'm talking about these modern, let's say, intellectuals of this type across the borders, were essentially demands for the adaptation or harmonization of interpretations of Islam to the circumstances of modernity. And they perceive these circumstances in terms of modern science, modern political thought, technical developments. But on the other hand, they again called for the reform of Islamic institutions and of Islamic, on the one hand, institutional reforms, but then also reform of the Sharia, of Islamic legal system, adapting it, as I said, to the new circumstances. And also one important thing which they had in common with many intellectuals, particularly from the German context back then, was the centrality of education as the field to, let's say, improve a society. So Bildung was also back then a very important part of the discussion in the German Protestantism of that time, but not only, So in their works, they employed concepts of religion, law, education, science, and politics that they derived from the modern social structure of a functionally differentiated society. In the theological field, one very important stress was on the rationality of Islam and on compatibility of Islam with modern sciences. So this was an issue which was also developed in polemics with Western scholars who approached the Muslim world saying, okay, you are backward and your religion is not compatible with modern developments, scientific developments, and so on. So very much of this was apologetic, of course. Now, having said this, of course, I do not want to skip the fact that many of the concepts that were used here and that were developed, let's say they were assimilated or synthesized with traditional concepts from Islamic scholarship. And many of these concepts, let's say, or many of these ideas, for example, the idea of the return to the original true Islam, which came up here, or which became very famous here. So how do you return to the original rational Islam without all these prejudices and without all the, let's say, mingling with what they consider, or many of them considered to be superstitious traditions of mysticism and so on. So this was one line of discourse. But the thought of going back to some sort of original, pure, true Islam was something that was very prominent here, but that was already advocated by some Islamic scholars of the 18th century before, in this, in various social movements, actually also from India to Saudi Arabia. So this was not a new figure, but it required a new meaning in this context. And another thing, which was also, or another figure or another topic which was central, was the ambivalence of the attitude towards Europe and towards modernity perceived as European modernity. When I say ambivalence, then we also have to historicize this. Until the late 19th century, until the beginning of the neo-imperialist project, the attitude towards Europe was not that negative, actually. So it was one of admiration and so on. But then, as I mentioned, the direct presence of European powers in the Muslim world, so the complete taking over, produced, a lot of resistance, and this ambivalence, while at the same time, again, keeping a very positive attitude towards certain developments in European contexts. For example, and this is something that maybe was the best or the most expressed with the Egyptian reformers of the Islah movement, of the Nahda movement in general, but it was also something that you could find in basically all those discoursive spaces where Muslims were engaged in. On the one hand, the political freedoms and the intellectual freedoms of European societies was something that was highly admired, but on the other hand, the political dominance of Europeans and the exploitation, basically, of course, was something that constituted a huge tension. And this was not only something that you could find among the Muslims of, let's say, the Middle East, Arabic-speaking Muslims. For those Muslims of the Russian Empire who had been incorporated into the empire during the 19th century, Russia was Europe, okay? So maybe Vasilios would not be surprised that, but on the one hand, just as the Muslim parts of Central Asia, of the Russian Empire, for the Russian Orientalists and Islamic scholars were considered the Orient, in the same way, the Muslim perspective of the Russian Muslims towards Russia was the one that was, Russia was Europe, colonial Europe. Actually, the same can be also said about Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina, who, particularly now in the last 50 years, have been, let's say, not stylized, but styled, portrayed as the authentic European Muslims. I mean, yes, of course, it's Europe, but also there, during the 20th century, you can find, and still you can find, highly ambivalent discourses on Europe. What is Europe in general? Of course, it's very stereotypical very often, so Europe is also imagined to be one entity and not the plurality of European societies as it is. But this ambivalence is, again, something which goes back to the colonial times. So, one of these concepts, which at this time emanated, let's say, from Western intellectual traditions, but which were adopted and became reproduced basically all over the world, was the modern notion of history and of historical consciousness. And this is something that in post-Enlightenment Europe, of course, became very, very, very prominent. And European societies as well showed an increased interest in history, but this can also be observed in the Muslim world since, too early, since the 19th century. History began to assume an identity-generating role. So It has been stated very often for modernity in general, and of course it applies for Muslim societies as well, that history is an issue. And historical discourses are always identity discourses. I think that is also something that we can witness today as well, also within the milieus that you describe, the new conservative milieus, which very strongly rely on historical narratives for their own justification and legitimization. But these processes usually accompany the larger process, or the discourses, the larger process of transformation and social change. And one manifestation of this new role of history, of course, was the emergence of national historiography across the world, also across the Muslim world, of secular national historiographies. And later on, during the 20th century, of course, we see the diversification of historiography. So there is the feminist historiography and Marxist historiography, and so different genres, of course. So that it's not possible to put this under one heading. However, we also see on the part of political Muslim movements a development of something of modern historical concepts, or at least pseudo-modern, however, historically modern, as a product of these modern developments. 5 to 10 minutes. Are you really sure? Thank you. I think I will be done in 15. Thank you. At least, at latest. One of these changes was the development of a particular salvation history based on the Quranic concept of history. So deriving, from the Quranic images, mentioning of civilizations, peoples, and so on, and putting this into larger categories as civilizational cultures. And this was a lot of these discourses were oriented toward back then contemporary cultural theorists like Spengler, for example. So Oswald Spengler was really big, with certain Muslim thinkers, again transnationally. But we can also find the centrality of this historical debates not only in the secular field but also in the religious, theological sphere, very, very strongly. Again, starting from the 19th century throughout the 20th century. Actually, I have written about this, and I will write again about this, expand more on this, but some of the major intellectual scandals in the Muslim world were tied to the question whether Muslim religious sources like Hadith and Quran can be accessed with the methods of modern historical scholarship. And these, let's say, scandals in Egypt, starting with Taha Hussein, who called into question the historicity of the Abraham narrative, saying it's a narrative, but it's not historically. Then going later on to Muslim scholars of Quran at the University of Cairo, Huli and Muhammad Halafallah, who said, that those historical narratives of prophets in the Quran had to be understood in a literally way. So it's the truth of God is not historical, it's literal. So God was a writer, not a historian. These things cause huge scandals. Halafallah was banned from writing his dissertation. His mentor, Huli, lost his job and was not allowed later on to teach about Quran and only about Arabic language, I think. So he was moved to another university and so on. So there's a number of these, let's say, developments. And at the center of these debates and struggles was the issue of how to deal with history and whether to approach these sources. So with modern historical methods, historical methodologies. And this is also my question that I asked, before: how do we deal with modern scholarship in the context of religious texts, and what consequences does this have? So, okay, I have to speed up just a second. What I want to show you, I'm coming to the last part 3 of my presentation. I would like to show you one, in my view, not typical, but one path of this, let's say, multiple entangled modernity into transmission of Muslim religious knowledge on the example of this, let's say, notion of history and historicity. So, and this path, I would like to start with Fazlur Rahman. Fazlur Rahman is, of course, not the first one. So, you know, but I cannot start with Adam and Eve, so I have to start somewhere. He was, of course, influenced by a lot, and in many ways influenced by modernist, reformist thinkers of Syria and Egypt, but not only. So he was born 1919 in Punjab, British India back then, and his father was a traditional Muslim jurist, alim and scholar, and he was educated in this, let's say, traditional field of knowledge, and he learned also the Quran by heart at a very young age. But his father was also very concerned with the fact that his son should obtain a secular education, and he sent him to the University of Punjab, where he obtained his master degree in Arabic studies. So he obtained, I think, also a PhD at the same university, but then he also went between 1946 and 1949 to complete his dissertation at the Oxford University. And the dissertation was on Avicenna and on the prophetology of Muslim philosophers. So, among others, his studies back then at Oxford under Hamilton Alexander Ruskin Gibb, who was one of the very big names of Oriental Western studies back then. And then from 1958 to 1961 at the newly established Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University in Canada. And at that time, again, at the McGill University, one large name of religious studies was very influential. This was Wilfrid Caldwell Smith, so scholar of religious studies, but also a very prominent name in the field of Islamic studies, who actually did also a lot of research onto the notion of history in Muslim sources. So in 1961, Fazlur Rahman was appointed to Pakistan's Central Institute of Islamic Research in Karachi, and he became his director, and this institute was very strongly involved in the attempts of the then Prime Minister Ayub Khan to modernize Pakistan society and somehow to give an Islamic justification to his modernization processes, which did not really go very, very well. So this was a very turbulent time in Pakistani politics, and he had, from the very start, Rahman, enormous difficulties in dealing with on the one hand, the modern Islamists in the wake of Maududi and Jamaat Islami, but also with traditional ulama. So. Okay, to cut it short, yes, I know, thank you. He was exiled, and there were huge campaigns against him, there were huge threats against him and his life and the life of his family. So he fled Pakistan, as many actually modern Muslim scholars of this time did, not only in the context of Pakistan, but also in context of other Muslim countries, which is not really something that as Muslims we should be proud of, but that's again a topic that we should discuss. However, he went to Chicago. So in Chicago, he taught there until his death in 1988. So Fazlur Rahman was very much influenced in his work by Hans-Georg Gadamer and Dilthey and this whole school of hermeneutics from Germany, as much as he was influenced by Muslim philosophers, by Ibn Sina, but also by other Aristotelians, and as much as he was influenced by Western scholars of Islamic studies. So history was the backbone of his work. So he wrote several works, several books and essays and so on this and chapters. But what became the issue of contestation in the Pakistani context was his dealing with hadith. And he's saying, engaging with the findings of historical scholarship back then and saying that the hadith were not actually historically authentic. A lot of it were not historically authentic. So this was one of the reasons why he had one of them to go. So in Chicago, he had several students from Turkey who were studying with him in the 70s and in the 80s, and who came back to Turkey, to University of Ankara. 2 minutes, Hassan, thank you. University of Ankara, again, had one of the first modern departments of Islamic theologies as a part of Turkish state modernization projects back then. But this department was strongly influenced or was designed by a guy who came from Bosnia, Tayyip Okic, and who himself had been trained in Sarajevo, in Paris, and at the Zaytuna University in Tunis. And in the Turkish context, he developed a design for a modern scholarly theology of the Turkish university. And at the same time, I know whether you can see it, one of the students, so Fazlur Rahman's students, among them Mehmet Aydin, one famous theologian, philosopher, and politicians in Turkey, who taught at the University of Ankara, and others, translated a lot of his works, again also engaging with Gadamer and Dilthey, but also with Schleiermacher, and not least with Tilman Nagel and Rudi Paret from Germany. So one of these students is Ömer Özsoy, who is fortunately my colleague at the University of Frankfurt, and who has had the first chair of Islamic theology in the German context since 2002. He did his habilitation with Tilman Nagel in Göttingen. Hardly believable, but yes, it is the case, given the development that Tilman Nagel has taken in the meantime. Again, yes. Yeah, it's history, exactly. However, Ömer and his, again, colleagues from the Ankara University have engaged in a project which has been described in the German language as a historical critical exegesis of the Quranic studies. But basically what they're doing is a claim to take the Quran seriously, of course, as a revelation coming from God, but still trying to understand it in the language of its own time, in the context of its own time, while referring to modern historical scholarship. So, and Ömer, in turn, in Germany, has had several students who, in the meantime, among them several women, are professors or having the chairs for Islamic theology in Germany. Among them, the first woman in tafsir studies, Quranic exegesis in Berlin, Nimet Sheker, yes, who is again positioning herself in this tradition, but departing a little bit, as it should be. So what I'm actually trying to show here is this whole path, that started with reformers in the 19th century, going, to the Reformist movements in India, and then Pakistan, and Cambridge, Chicago, Turkey, back to Tunisia, and so on. I'm not saying that Gadamer is coming home, let's say, in the form of Islamic theology, but certainly what is happening here, let's say, it's a new epistemological foundation of Islam. Thank you very much.